Diabetes is a very complex disease. It's a group of metabolic disorders, meaning where those with diabetes have a difficulty metabolizing glucose that is ingested through our diet. So if we're visiting over here, we ingest glucose all the time as our primary mechanism for getting energy. We may ingest cookies. We may ingest apples or fruits, different types of carbohydrates that are broken down give us glucose into our bloodstream. After they're absorbed into our stomach, they move down into our small intestines where most of it is absorbed. It travels via the venous system, back past the liver, through the heart, and then through the lungs and back into the heart and to the rest of our body to the tissues where that glucose is needed. As the glucose that we eat travels into our bloodstream, in a normal patient, this glucose creates a gradient in our blood that is equalized with water. This glucose needs to move into our muscles, which are the primary users of our energy. Our muscles are used for 90% of our heat. They're highly vascularized. They have a lot of blood flow to them. They need that glucose to be transferred into energy. So this glucose is trying to get into our muscular system. How it lets it into the muscles is the insulin that's created by the B cells inside the island of Langerhans inside of our pancreas, part of the endocrine system. These insulin respond to the excessive glucose in our blood and travel to these cells, and they act as a key in which the glucose cannot enter these muscle cells until the glucose unlocks the door, and then glucose can be let inside the cell, giving the muscles the energy they need to make you feel energetic and use it throughout the day. In a diabetic patient, there are multiple things that can happen, but for whatever reason, glucose is not able to enter into these muscle cells, and glucose remains hanging out in the blood chronically. So for whatever reason, insulin is not able to be produced or used effectively, and it results in chronic hyperglycemia or excessive blood sugar levels. A few different types of diabetes. In type 1 diabetes, which amounts for about 5% of diabetics, this is an idiopathic disease. It's autoimmune in that our own immune cells are responsible for destroying these B cells of islet of Langerhans, and no insulin or very little insulin is able to be produced. So now, without these insulin, glucose is just hanging out in their blood, hyperglycemia occurs, the patient is diagnosed with diabetes in that way. This is generally familial. It seems to point to genetics, but again, we don't know. So oftentimes it's just, it runs in families, and there's risk factors that have environmental triggers that spur on this idiopathic autoimmune reaction. That's only about 5% of diabetics. 90 to 95% of diabetics have type 2 diabetes mellitus. It is an epidemic in this country. The rates of diabetes are going up extreme. About 8% of Americans have diabetes type 2 right now. Diabetes type 2 has several different reasons that may cause or put a patient at risk. It is also idiopathic, and we don't know an exact cause that causes it, but the highest risk factors have to do with our family history and things with that nature. It can be familial, but also very, very distinctly associated with lifestyle factors. One of the largest risk factors has to do with obesity and how it causes what's called insulin resistance. If we're revisiting this, insulin cells are back in the pancreas. As we ingest these elements of glucose back into our bloodstream, if we choose very high nutrient, very low calories having to do with carbohydrates like fruits, vegetables, etc., whole grains, these are much more readily absorbed into the bloodstream, much more readily absorbed into the muscles, and it creates low postprandial or low after meal glucose levels. If we choose very high level calorie, very low nutrient dense, they tend to build up in our bloodstream excessively, and they're a lot harder to get into our cells. But in a young, healthy individual, there's enough insulin to let all of those cells in. In a diabetic patient, quite often it has to do with insulin resistance, where these glucose cells knock on the door of these muscles, and these insulin are able to be produced, and they let them in. No problem. But what happens if these fat cells that are naturally inside of our muscle cells, they don't get more numerous, but they get larger. The more glucose we ingest and the more we accept into our body, the more it's turned into fat, converted into fat, and stored as fat. These fat cells, what if, instead of getting more numerous, because they can't, but what if we just stored more and more glucose because we ate too many cookies and didn't work it off, and now these fat cells that were once small now turn large. And now if there's too many fat cells, this insulin can literally not reach these muscles in order to let the glucose in that they so desperately need. Fat is very low vascularity level, not much blood flow through there. They will literally block the entrance, and insulin cannot get in, and glucose cannot get into the cells in that way.